Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. This session is entitled Perspectives from Industry. And we have four very distinguished speakers, as you can see on the board here. They're all from sectors who are heavily exposed to technology and therefore have a big interest in our topic today. So just to briefly introduce them, firstly Grant King. Grant's not here, but Grant has recorded a video which we'll see shortly, and clearly you won't be able to ask him any questions. Of another engineer, we have Bill Cox, who's the Chief Executive of Oricon, a global engineering consultancy, and we have Group Captain Ellison, who's actually not on this program. He's on the online program, but he was a late addition to the program, but he's very welcome, and it's very nice to see someone in uniform here as well. And Marlene Kanga, who's from Engineers Australia, former global CEO of the Federation of Engineering Organisations. And an ATSE Fellow, indeed, as is Bill. Bill's an ATSE Fellow as well. So, we might get underway with running Grant's video. We got that under control.
So good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this forum on engineering education. I notice we have a sub-theme of Can a Crisis Be Averted? And this particular session is an industry perspective on engineering education. And I'm going to interpret that session heading quite liberally in making some comments based firstly on my experience over many years in industries, particularly electricity and more recently the water industry, where I've had responsibility for large capital and operating programs. So I want to comment briefly on some perspectives over those many years. And that's a bottom-up view. And then secondly, I'd like to present a bit of a top-down view on what I think are some of the key challenges for engineering education. So if we go to the question firstly of education, what is education? I'm sure that's been debated significantly or discussed significantly already in this forum. And I'd just like to make sure that when I use the word, I don't mean perhaps the narrower sense of formal education we might have at university. I'm going to interpret education to mean lifelong learning. How do we develop through our working lives both the knowledge and skills and experience to be effective in the things that we do, and obviously in this context, particularly in terms of engineering. I mentioned I wanted to give a bottom-up view and a top-down view. The bottom-up view really comes from my experience over many years. And I want to draw on two projects I was involved in, two of many, but from which I remember particular events and days where there was quite powerful learnings for me, and also one comment in terms of my general experience over many years in business. The first of the projects I want to talk to was building an offshore platform in the middle of Bass Strait back in 2005, which became exceptionally difficult because that was the year that Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf of Mexico and effectively pulled everything that floated in the oil and gas industry into the Gulf of Mexico. And therefore it was a particularly challenging project to finish. The first of the experiences I want to refer to was the construction of a pipeline, a subsea, about a 100 kilometre subsea pipeline, which then had to wait a year and a half before we put it into service. And whilst we believed we'd taken the actions to keep that pipeline in good standing, I remember a meeting, sitting in a room, doing a risk assessment as to was it safe to bring that pipeline into service as we completed the project. And the thing that struck me in that room was that there was not a person younger than 50 years old in that room, and this was back in 2005. Everybody in that room was going to retire in the next 10 years. And there was no one 30 or 40, no one there listening to the extraordinary experience that these people brought to that discussion. Now, the good news is that we did bring that pipeline back into service safely. The collective experience of about 10 or 15 engineers around that table was all brought to bear to come up with the right answer. But the thing that struck me was how reliant we were on an ageing cadre of people in our industry. And as I say, this was nearly 20 years ago. The second experience on that same project was a lift. We were lifting a compressor package onto the platform, and one of the lifting ropes failed, or guys, actually steel cables failed. Clearly very troubling. Fortunately, no one was injured and nothing was lost. But we didn't understand why it was failed, and we couldn't conduct a lift until we'd done the analysis and understood what had happened. It took us over 18 months to find an engineering consultancy that could actually find the failure mode and describe what happened. And it was quite a complex combinations of sea states and wind states and cable lengths and harmonics, the detail of which I don't need to go into. But the point is, it took a global search and a year and a half to find someone capable of analysing that particular situation and identifying for us a safe lifting procedure. So the lesson I took out of that was very much the deep expertise we also need in our industry. So experience born of many years of work in industry combined with very, very deep expertise for those of us in the engineering profession or those in the engineering profession who have that penchant for very deep dive and deep technical skills. They also play a critical role. The second project I want to refer to was when we were constructing an LNG project in Queensland, one of 3 projects built in central and southern Queensland, coming through to, of course, the 3 LNG plants on Curtis Island. A remarkable experience to be involved in over 6 years, $70 billion of capital projects, creating a massive new export industry for Australia. An extraordinary project, but what struck me more than any other thing was the incredible complexity of delivering a project of that scale. And it's often said next to the defence industry and probably the nuclear industry, building LNG plants is probably one of the most complex engineering endeavours that are undertaken. And I was in constant awe of those people who were running those projects and who had this incredible capacity to deal with very complex problems, very complex situations and working relationships and get this thing built. And what I took out of that was the incredible importance of integrative skills, the capacity to look more broadly than the immediate task at hand and deliver a whole, deliver an outcome which was of itself the sum of a very large number of very complex pieces of work. The other thing I want to refer to, and I learnt from that project, and it moves not away from engineering, because engineering should move towards these issues, was the incredibly complex issues around social licence to operate. And these issues are becoming even more complex today. We were operating on many hundreds of landowners' properties. We were building linear infrastructure across, again, many hundreds of properties. We were dealing in an area, particularly in respect of water and water extraction from the Great Artesian Basin. It was a complex issue for the farming and environmental community. And without putting appropriate effort and attention to these complex social and environmental issues, we would never have been able to complete that project. So again, what I took out of that is the need to make sure that in terms of both the education and experience that our engineering community gains, it's very important to, of course, look beyond what might be a more narrow definition of engineering or engineering and science to a broader definition that allowed us to incorporate and ensure that the communities in which we work, because for sure, most engineering projects are large and impact communities in very significant ways. So the import of developing those skills and those awareness was also very critical. The last thing I wanted to refer to when we talk about bottom-up type issues, and I'm sure many in this room, many listening to this presentation, will have sat through endless succession planning sessions. And the other thing that strikes us very clearly is particularly for engineering-based businesses with large capital and operating assets, we tend to draw our management from people with engineering backgrounds. And we all know, and we're still struggling to make sure that we get enough women into engineering from the very first undergraduate degree, but also through their own progression and their own learning. And I also think it's very important that engineering, with the longer definition of lifelong education, can embrace people, particularly women, who often come to their businesses and their organisations with non-engineering backgrounds and help them very quickly become, and when I say become, not necessarily an engineer in the way that one might think of beginning engineering as an undergraduate profession, but to gain the skills and the ability to work with engineers, and dare I say, to think like engineers, in a way that allows them to be a part of the ongoing management of our businesses. It's also an imperative, in addition to these social licence issues, that we make sure that our education, our lifelong learning processes respond to the need that we have to make sure that women can also play their role in the ongoing management of these businesses and, of course, in the engineering profession overall. I also wanted to offer what I call a top-down view, and a sub-theme of this session, or this talk, not my talk, but the conference overall, is Can a Crisis Be Averted? And it talks about that in terms of lack of engineers. The crisis that most people want to talk about now is climate change and responding to climate change. And very few people truly understand the scale of task that we have to undertake to get to a net zero world. So many people have signed on, obviously, or at least emotionally, to net zero by 2050. I can assure you very, very, very few people truly understand the magnitude of change that is necessary for us to make as a community in order to achieve that objective in something less than 25 or so years. And bearing in mind, a significant number of people would like to see and argue that we get to net zero before 2050, possibly even less than 25 years. To take a glimpse of that future, that means by 2050, everything that's produced today in a refinery has to be produced somewhere else. Refineries as we know them today shouldn't exist in 25 years' time. All of the thermal power generation we have in the world has to cease to operate and be replaced with zero carbon generation, be it nuclear, be it renewables, or any other form of generation that's net zero or zero carbon. We need massive investment in long-duration storage to make these systems work. In theory, there's no internal combustion engines left in the world. We're either driving electric vehicles or, again, zero-carbon fuels like hydrogen, or potentially liquid fuels, potentially biofuels, etc. We need rainfall-independent water supply. So the water that we today draw largely from dams and rely on storing rainfall over extended periods, we can no longer rely on the metrology that used to sit behind these dams because we can't rely on the same sort of climate or patterns of weather as the climate changes. Coastal engineering, as sea levels rise, a lot of the infrastructure around our coasts is at threat. Our ports, for example, our water infrastructure, which all falls to sea level, is all at threat if sea levels rise 50 centimetres or more through the balance of this century. And of course, providing water for not just urban communities, but for irrigation as the patterns of rainfall change are also massive challenges. In short, the scale of this task is extraordinarily large, and the crisis, it is right to say that we need engineers and there's a crisis that we don't have enough, but it's a greater crisis that we don't deploy the technologies that we have available to us and that we yet need to develop at the scale that's necessary to achieve targets like net zero by 2050. So my final question, commentary, and by way of summary, would be say to follow. Clearly, when we think about lifelong learning in engineering, we need to develop and nurture those people whose penchant is for the development of very deep technical skills that can develop and invent the things we need to deal with the challenges of the future. We need people of extraordinary experience who can apply their learning over many years to deal with the complex problems that we face every day in running the assets that we all, in many ways, take for granted, but which underpin the standard of living that we enjoy today. We need to make sure that we develop people who have the capacity to think through complex issues and think integratively about what are the solutions to these issues. So that sort of deep integrative thinking is an essential requirement. And of course, we need to develop what one might think of as a softer set of skills, but skills that respond to community needs around social license to operate as that landscape becomes more and more complex, and also ensures that we develop the sort of equity, including gender and other forms of equity balance in our workplaces, so that our profession can be attractive to people no matter from where they come, no matter from what their background. My final message would be that if we want to avert a crisis, the scale that needs to be the scale of the task that needs to be undertaken is truly, truly huge. It will need scientists and engineers far more so than we have today and that we are graduating and developing today. And I think in order to do that, we need to enlist people from young ages in understanding that if they want to make an impact and they want to save the world, then the best place to do it from is to be an engineer. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I trust you're enjoying the conference and that it all goes very well for you. Thank you.
We have another engineer. Bill, I think, no doubt, thinks like an engineer, although in a very diverse context, Bill.
Thanks, George, for that, and I think to Grant and many of the things that he said, I will be touching on similar themes with the time that I've got available, and I think to just pick up on this issue of crisis. And some of you will be aware of a word that was the word of the year last year, and that was permacrisis. And it's a word that you can Google, and it's basically a word that describes the overlay of crises that we have just started to become conditioned to over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, and that is going to be an ongoing challenge for us, and whether it's climate change, whether it's resilience in terms of flooding, in terms of heat and weather events, whether it is energy transition, decarbonisation, let alone pandemics and the health impacts that we're all suffering, and that is something that is going to challenge all of us. and we are seeing that in how people are responding to this overlay. And if you think about the Irish traveller who stops on the side of the road and asks the farmer, "Could you tell me how to get to Dublin?" And the answer comes back, "If I wanted to go to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here." We do need to reflect that we are where we are in dealing with a lot of these things, and that is something that we as a society, let alone we as the leaders of the STEM profession and creating the next generation of STEM professionals, have a massive role to play in terms of attracting the scale of people that we need to come through, and at a pace to do with all of the issues that Grant has spoken about. And in a similar way, to recognise that it starts at a very young age, and the speaker from the Department of Education did fill me with great heart before lunch in terms of recognising how that investment needs to start, and the role that we all need to play, both in terms of boys and girls, young men, young women, coming through the education system at a scale. And we talked this morning about the pipeline. The pipeline is not big enough. And so for us to have a role to play in terms of expanding that pipeline, that's something that we see as a business, that I see as an industry, in terms of having enough capability to be able to deliver all of the infrastructure that we talked about through the Infrastructure Australia showed, and with a diversity of thought, diversity of skills, and creating an inclusive culture around that diversity where we get the best answers and the best solutions to some incredibly challenging issues that we've already touched on. And that also raises the issue for us in terms of ATSE, Engineers Australia, Consult Australia, Infrastructure Australia, in terms of brand, in terms of what engineers and scientists can actually do and must do, and the vital role that we play to be able to impact the crises that we've talked about, and the perceptions that we have or people have of us, and how we change that in terms of being able to solve the big issues, and solve them we must. And the pace at which those issues need to be solved is not small. We talk about 2050. 2050 is a good number, but the way the trends are showing at the moment, that's going to be where we are going to be over a 2-degree increase in global warming. That is an unacceptable answer. So in terms of actually getting to a 1.5 degree increase, we just about lose about 10 years off that. So the scale, once again, and to the points that Grants were making, in terms of the changes and the impact and the scale of decarbonisation, and shifting to renewable energy and getting rid of fossil fuel, that is something that should not be something that we walk past too quickly, because of the changes that we're seeing and the scale of engineering and science impact that's needed. Just needs to be accelerated. In terms of what we're seeing, the young people coming out of our engineering schools and our science schools, they are incredibly impressive. Compare that with the graduation ceremonies that I would have seen a generation ago, in terms of how articulate they are, in terms of the impact that they want to have, and the passion that they bring. Truly impressive. And so we need to be able to use those people as the people that go into our schools, go into our undergraduate classes, and really sort of create that pipeline of people that will come in and have that impact. Beyond that, then going through the profession over the course of people's careers and recognising the changes they need to be able to think about in terms of where they might have started their careers and how they transition it into the areas where we actually need it. Taking people with adjacent skills, taking people that have trained up where at the start of their careers they might have been focused on the built environment, tall buildings, commercial infrastructure. How do they transition and take those skills into the massive scale of hydrogen plants, ammonia plants, green manufacturing facilities that are going to be needed as part of the transition. Similar skills just need to be transitioned, but at scale. And the passion with which people bring to that is absolutely essential. The last point for me to make is to also recognise the significant skills that are sitting in the older members of our population in engineering and science that still have a vital role to play. Within my business, we have a growing number of people in their 60s and 70s who are still adding significant value in terms of checking the work, verifying the work of younger engineers and scientists to make sure that we get it right. That's the other expectation that society has on us in terms of being able to make sure that what we design, what gets built and what gets used is fundamentally safe and fit for purpose. And that is not something that we can sort of take the view that when you hit 60 that your career's over. Definitely not. And that's another component in terms of how we make sure that we have the skills and the capability to make it work. And lastly, the culture of engineering and science needs to change. If we want people to join the industry, if we want people to stay, then they've got to feel that there's a role for them to play. And the days of just being a hard man's game needs to change. And that's something fundamentally important that we all need to take a part in being able to lead that change. So on that note, George, thank you. Happy to take questions later on in the session.
Yeah, I think we'll leave questions to the end, and I'm not actually sure we'll have time, but we'll see how we go. And thanks for that, Bill. I mean, as you point out, 2050 is actually not far away when you think about it. I don't know, we'll have Snowy 2.0 by then or not.
Snowy 12.0 by the sounds of it, that's the headline today.
Okay, I'll introduce Chris Ellison.
G'day, Chris Ellison, the Director of Military Recruiting from Headquarters Defence Force Recruiting out of Canberra. I'll seek to be brief so that there is an opportunity for questions. I won't speak to the challenges of climate change because in effect the two previous speakers have done that. What I can speak to are things that are inside my lane, and that is largely the business of trying to find people to work for defence. Unsurprisingly for anybody in this room, we remain a technologically driven organisation, particularly across Air Force and Navy, a little less so for Army, but that's the current force. We continue to move from what are the existing domains of land, sea and air and expanding our reach into the likes of cyber and space. These are nascent capabilities inside the organisation, but all of these similarly need people to work inside them, and only now are we starting to establish how we're going to look for those people, what types of people do we need, what does the spaceman look like, what do we want those people to do, and how we're going to recruit for them. Overlay that with the Defence Strategic Review released earlier this year, which called out a number of areas of development that the government would like us to pursue. So, again, unsurprisingly, they call out the requirement to continue the pursuit of nuclear-powered submarines. So there's a very small nuclear enterprise, in this nation, and in order to support nuclear-powered submarines, that's going to need to be built and built reasonably rapidly. Both in defence and inside our public service colleagues and industry in order to support that activity. The second priority of the Defence Strategic Review is allowing Australia to possess and develop long-range strike. Now all of that's guided missiles, that's all types of different technologies which we've not used before. Our last key long-range strike mechanism was the F-111, and we parked it years ago. So we're going to have to rebuild some of those skill sets, and in fact, travel down paths we haven't moved down before. One of the other lines of the DSR is that defence be capable of using innovative and disruptive technologies quickly. And the lessons from the Ukraine, I guess, are speaking large in that line. Our Ukrainian colleagues have repurposed, rebadged, reused, built all types of things against their Russian enemies that we hadn't considered. They have been able to deliver vastly disproportionate military effect for what they've got and what they're using. The Australian government isn't necessarily seeking that from us, but they are seeking us to bring a mind to these military problems, which allows us to, rapidly accept the problem and innovate to deal with it. And that requires smart technicians, typically led or aided by smart engineers. So most of you, I expect, will know that Defence does we do a lot of that education piece ourselves. You can join as an engineer. We'll stick with engineers. You can join as an engineer through the Australian Defence Force Academy, and be formally qualified with the University of New South Wales. We run an undergraduate scheme where, in effect, we'll pay you to go to university, but that scheme's not as well known as we might wish it to be. We'll take you as a just graduated engineer, and we'll equally consider you for mid-career entry. But that's an area that the services have struggled with. Can we offer the right employee value proposition for a mid-career entrant? And given that we ordinarily grow ourselves from, having left high school to up the system, how best do we deal with a mid-career entrant who brings deep engineering skills and solid managerial capability and kind of just stick them into the organisation in an organisation that's driven very much by rank and hierarchy? Can we do that without stirring the pot unnecessarily? So there are lots of challenges that lie ahead for Defence in finding ways to address government's new priorities along with the existing priorities of Defence.
Bruce? Marlene?
I've got a presentation. May I go up?
Yeah, can we put the presentation up, please?
Try and speak fast. So I'm from industry, and I saw the problems that have been articulated so well by Bill and Grant before me. In fact, it almost seemed as if Grant had seen my presentation, because it was almost like word for word what I'm going to say. So I'll speak quickly. I saw the problem that's been articulated and set out to do something about it. And this is a short sort of narrative about what has been done. And it also brings in the global perspective, because the Australian education system is a system within a global system. And the mobility of our Australian engineers is facilitated by the fact that our qualifications have mutual recognition across some 13 plus nations through the International Engineering Alliance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how what impact that has on the problem that we're talking about today. So that's a little bit about me. So I was president of the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, which is a peak body which has the professional engineering institutions of the world as its members, some 100 members. And that's the member map. The blue area show you the member map. And we have some continental members, such representing, say, Asia Pacific, the Americas, Africa, and so on. And we represent engineering at the United Nations and its UN organizations. We're the co-chair of the major, what's called the Major Science and Technology Group at the United Nations. As president, I had the privilege of celebrating the 50th anniversary of the World Federation in March 2018. And we signed this declaration with UNESCO which stated our commitment to advance the UN Sustainable Development Goals through engineering. So these goals, the member states declared that they wanted to look at an integrated approach to development, which looked at not just environmental issues, but social, economic, health, and so on. And they articulated this through 17 goals in September 2015. We're actually at the halfway mark. And so almost all these goals require engineering. So again, the big picture, the big need for engineers. And so we stated our commitment. And part of that was we recognized the need for more engineers with the right skills where they're needed most. So here are the 17 goals. And as I said, every engineering is required for almost all of them. We published the second UNESCO engineering report in March 2021 on World Engineering Day. And chapter 1, which I wrote, has 3 recommendations, which again articulate this need for us to increase the number and quality of engineers, to work in partnership to ensure that we have the necessary international engineering education benchmarks, and to recognize these benchmarks across the world, especially where we need the most engineers. And the title of that report eventually changed to Engineering for Sustainable Development as part of the discussions and the increasing recognition of the role of engineering for sustainable development. So here's the report card. This will officially be released in September this year, but I'm a reviewer, so I've given you a sneak preview. And it's not a good one. We've progressed very little on most of the goals, and we've actually gone backwards on some of these. Interestingly, this report was authored by scientists. There was not one engineer on this Global Sustainable Development report card. Yet, they have a case, they mention engineers only once in this report card. And it's in the context of the work that engineers did in reducing the hole in the ozone layer. It's an example of the work of engineers in addressing a global challenge. When CFCs were banned, it was engineers that came up with alternatives and then designed the refrigeration and HVAC systems with those alternative refrigerants to eliminate the use of CFCs, and therefore the hole in the ozone layer is set to close mostly by 2040. And so this, ironically, was in this report as a case study, the only time they mention engineers. So I give it a lot of airplay. And again, you can see here, the tipping point to energy transition. We're getting very close, and you can see again, it's the work of engineers that's making that happen in terms of looking at alternative renewable sources. So engineers, we need them. But of course, in Australia, we've got a big shortage. This is from a report by Professionals Australia, which looks at the skill gap. And according to them, 2/3 of engineers in Australia aren't working in engineering, and half the migrants aren't working in engineering. So we have a very leaky pipeline. We've talked about the pipeline needing to be bigger, but the pipeline is also very full of holes. And I think this is the uncomfortable truth that we as leaders need to address. We need to look at why, not just bringing in young people, graduate them, because they come in and then they fall out very quickly, in fact, in some cases, in the first 10 years of graduation. And we need to understand why and address that issue. So I think that's one of the things that we really need to consider as well. Migration has been a source of filling the gap, but many of the migrant engineers, for example, they're not members of Engineers Australia, and so we've had about a couple of 100,000 come into the country in the last 20 years since the mining boom. But our membership in Engineers Australia has not grown as fast. So we need a change. And we've heard this again from Grant King and from Bill about the changes that we need. So yes, we need to change. We've got to shift in terms of technology, to take into account the very rapidly changing technology, and we need, of course, the core skills in maths and science, but we also need to develop other skills among our engineers at the education point of education, IT skills, data analytics, and also a little bit of liberal arts training and looking at new and emerging technologies. So, for example, civil engineering, they say that most of civil engineering, I'm not a civil engineer, so I don't know what I'm talking about, but most civil engineers, I'm told, there's a lot of code. So you could design most, the major parts of works using artificial intelligence and computer programs. And so civil engineers also need to have those data skills. And of course, you've got BIM and simulations and other things also coming into use. And I'm a chemical engineer, and certainly that's very important, and iChemie has now established a digitalization working group to take into account the increase in digital skills. A big need, top-down, which Grant also mentioned, is the cultural shift. And this is the cause of the leaky pipeline as well. We need to change the culture of engineering and engineering organizations to make them places where people want to work and want to have a long-term career. But we also need to ensure that engineers have those skills to communicate, especially with stakeholders, to maintain that social license, to have entrepreneurial skills, to be risk takers, and to work inclusively in diverse teams. And of course, we need the diversity shift. We desperately need to access 50% of the world's brain power, because women can be fantastic engineers. And I think that this again is part of the leaky pipeline, because women who do come in to study engineering in Australia, many of them leave, and they leave, and they leave, and they leave. So how to address this? I actually initiated a review of the global engineering benchmark. The International Engineering Alliance has governance over this benchmark, and it hadn't changed. It had changed. There had been a few changes made, but no substantial change since it was first established in the late 80s. So I went up to their meeting in July 2018 and pitched this first to their board, and then they liked what I had to say, and they asked me to speak to all the signatories at that meeting. And from that, we initiated a collaborative project to review the benchmarks, which is the foundation structure of the engineering education systems that all 30 signatories comply with, including all the universities in Australia. And you can see here the list of other partners that collaborated, that were consulted with. We collaborated with around 60 countries around the world. And we brought in, for example, FIDIC, the Global Consulting Engineers, the Women Engineers Network, the first time that they were consulted with, IFES, the Federation of Engineering Education Societies, which I know our Australian AAE is a member of, and so on. And here are the key areas that we looked at for change, which are look remarkably like what Grant King had mentioned. Adapt to the requirements of the future engineering disciplines and practice areas that are going to emerge very quickly, intellectual agility, creativity, and innovation, new ways of learning and addressing emerging technologies, and of course, active work experience and lifelong learning. This was mentioned. Incorporating UN Sustainable Development Goals and looking at the impact of engineering work on the people, on planet, and so on, and leave no one behind, looking at the social license there, of course. The soft skills of being able to accommodate, attributes of teamwork, communication. We included a new element of ethics in the professional competency side and really took a broad view of ethics. And of course, diversity inclusion. We introduced gender neutral language in the framework for the first time and sprinkled diversity all the way through. It's not a separate element, it's part of the whole framework. So we did this in record time, started November 2019, approved June 2021, done all through COVID lockdown, and it's been translated into the 6 UNESCO languages. And it's been embraced from around the world. The feedback has been enormous. The signatories have 5 years, including Australia, to implement, that is by 2026. And here are the translations. So I just wanted to give you an idea of the work that's been done, and in fact the changes that we've been talking about, those changes have already been, the structure's already been put into place, so it's now up to the educators to implement that framework, that blueprint for the engineering education that we're all sort of agreed, I think, that we need. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. So we're sort of right on time for afternoon tea, but I think after all those excellent speeches, I think we should encroach in afternoon tea by about 10 minutes and allow some time for questions. If anyone is really desperate for a coffee, you're welcome to go out and get it, but I think we should devote some time to questions. So who's up the back here?
Thank you. Oricon, how the transition that you explained the engineers need to make from sectors that are high carbon to low carbon, how will you be, how will the engineers make that transition?
So we have hundreds of engineers who work in areas where you can certainly see that digital disruption, high value, low cost design centres that we have spread in different parts of the world, Vietnam, Philippines, South Africa, for example, can do more and more of that work for us when it's needed. Taking people that have got related qualifications here in Australia and in New Zealand, which are high cost locations, relatively speaking, and apply those skills into and adapt those skills into areas of renewable energy in particular, and really helping to build the workforce around the energy transition, which is one of the big sort of areas that we all are struggling with in terms of having enough capabilities. So taking people with electrical engineering skills, mechanical engineering skills, and being able to apply those into these areas where we've got a massive pipeline of opportunity, but without the capability to actually deliver it. So that's the sort of transition, that's the type of reskilling that we're seeing the opportunity, and that we're seeing people being able to make that change and wanting to make that change into areas of significant growth. And that in addition to that, to the point that Marlene made around the transition for migrants coming in to this country with related skills, to be able to take them into those areas of growth. That's where we see the opportunity, that's where we see the demand, and that's all part of how we sort of meet that shift and that growth that we need to be able to achieve.
John.
I've got a question for Chris from the ADF. Chris, as I said, I'm involved with UNSW, with the Faculty Advisory Committee there, and as you're probably aware, there's only 2 nuclear power engineering courses, both postgraduate, available in Australia at the moment. I think the great number of graduates each year is like 10 or maybe 12 or something like that. How in the context of AUKUS and the coming need for many more qualified nuclear power engineers, I mean, even to operate either the Virginia-class submarine or the new AUKUS-class submarine, you'll need nuclear power qualified operators on the actual submarines, putting aside even the design of these ships. Can you sort of give us some sort of context or your estimate of how many nuclear power qualified engineers we're going to need over the next 30 years to achieve this, and not just to achieve that it is effectively what is a new design in the case of AUKUS, but also to operate both Virginia class subs, which we're going to get from the Americans, and also the new AUKUS class sub.
We're going to stray a little bit outside of my usual lane here because I'm a member of Air Force, and so my knowledge of Navy is not as deep as it could be. The short answer to your question is a lot of engineers. How, perhaps the more obvious question that you'd really like answered is how we're going to get there. Some of these aren't problems for Defence Force recruiting to solve, but I've got a general awareness, I think, about how Navy intends to get around this problem. So, in the broad, it's Navy's intent that clearly there are, in effect, either military academies / universities in the US and the UK, and there are similar civilian universities in the US and the UK that they send their naval personnel to receive that training. And it is the Royal Australian Navy's intent that they would send either uniformed personnel who are going to operate the sub, or our industry and public service personnel who need to support the sub to those schools, on the basis that, you know, we clearly need to build a sovereign capability in our own nation to run that. In the near term, the solution is to, in effect, is to take that offshore to other people who do it properly, bring those lessons home and develop those skills. I can't tell you how long there's an intent to rely on our American and British friends to do that. If I was to have a punt, and it's a somewhat uneducated punt, it's probably the next 10 years that we would need to do that until we could have a meaningful development of our own, organic capability in Australia. Does that answer your question?
From the perspective of someone like Oricon, we've heard quite a bit this morning about the big pool of migrant engineers. I guess it's not a simple problem as it sounds. What are the roadblocks from a consulting engineering standpoint to getting more migrant engineers into the workforce?
Certainly, the visa process through the government is one that the more streamlined that can be is an important part of sort of opening up capacity in that regard. The recognition of overseas qualifications and experience is another dimension through Engineers Australia to be able to do that. And I think the other aspect, and it also goes to the previous question and discussion, for Australia to recognise we can be an incredibly parochial place, and that in recognising the skills and capabilities that people have from doing very similar types of infrastructure right around the world, being able to bring people in who have done incredible things in different continents around the world, just because it happens to be done in Australia, we need to think about what are the standards and what are the expectations, and how can we sort of embrace people who have been here, been doing this in different parts of the world, as opposed to sort of saying we're special. And we see it too often in terms of people. We see it too often in terms of companies who want to come in, bring more competition, open us up to technology, to ways of doing things, and allow us to do things at pace, and they get incredibly frustrated, not just by the one country, but by the 7 different states and territories that we have, who all want to do it in a different way. So I think there are a number of different learnings as to how to solve some of these issues that we've been talking about today. We need to be, thinking on a more global scale than we perhaps have, and there are a few different dimensions to that, I grant you, but they're some of the roadblocks.
I think Marlene might have a perspective
Sorry,
on that.
I will step down off the soapbox now, but I think you got the point.
Yeah, I think, Marlene, you might have something to add from an EA perspective.
Yeah, I mentioned that, we've got a pipeline full of holes, but we've got a lot of engineers that aren't even in the pipeline. They come into this country with great aspirations, and they can't get into the system. And in fact, I was refused membership of Engineers Australia, even though I had a master's from Imperial College, and I've got the letter. How's that for tenacity? But there are hundreds that I know of engineers who've come in on 4, 5, 7 visas, who are working in senior positions, and whose qualifications aren't recognized. So they cannot get chartered, they can't become members of Engineers Australia, and they can't become chartered. There is a way. Engineers Australia tells me they've got a way, but you've got to pay, I think, $1,800, and there's no guarantee that you'll get through even if you pay. So a lot of engineers just don't bother, and they're out of the system, outside. The point of this is that once you get out, you're not part of the Engineers Australia system, then you have a tendency, especially for women, to leave engineering altogether because your career is not developing. And so there's a half of the migrant women engineers, I'm told from the Professionals Australia survey, are not working in engineering. And I do know quite a large number of women who have engineering qualifications, who were working as engineers overseas, who've come in and are working in banks and other areas. Which is a big loss to us. So we really need to look at the pipeline to get young students in through engineering to graduate, to study, etc. It's about 10 years down the track. Whereas here, this is low-hanging fruit. We can do this, today, tomorrow. We can put our heads together and address this issue, and I think bring in hundreds of engineers into the workforce if we choose to do so.
Thanks, Marlene. I know people up the back are getting a bit twitchy about time, and I'd love to keep the conversation going, but I think we'll have to break for afternoon tea and be back here maybe about at 2:35.